Universidad de Cambridge, que bueno, está haciendo su tesis de doctorado sobre vocabulario en el libro de jueces. Ya está acabándola, prácticamente la tiene casi concluida.
Sí.
Nos hemos encontrado en Wuppertal y hemos coincidido, la verdad es que ha sido muy, muy grato. Y bueno, pues hoy ha venido a hablarnos precisamente de este tema, de vocabulario en griego en jueces y la relación con la documentación de la época. Y bueno, pues nada más, les dejo con él. Estoy seguro que será un tema muy, muy interesante.
Thank you all for coming. It's really good to be here, and I hope that we can have some profitable conversation about some of this material. Can everyone see okay? There should be, please, we need to turn out more lights.
Así mejor.
Mejor.
Así mejor.
I think so, yeah. In this lecture, I will attempt to bring together at least three quite distinct areas of study. First, the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, which I will refer to generally as the Septuagint. Secondly, a methodologically sound approach to lexical semantics, the study of word meaning. And third, a very large body of documentary evidence for Koine Greek found throughout the Hellenistic world, focusing on material from Ptolemaic Egypt. As for this last area of study, accurately studying and understanding the Greek papyri and inscriptions is bound up with understanding the occasion of their production, purpose, and historical setting. I refer to this as the social context. After the death of Alexander the Great, the unifying factor in the tumultuous Hellenistic world became the Koine language, the influence of which permeated every layer of society. To speak Greek was the first step in upward social mobility by assimilating Greek ways of life. And of course, the Jewish community in Egypt was no exception. For this reason, ever since Adolf Deismann's work in the Greek papyri, scholars have increasingly recognized the importance of integrating study of the language of the Septuagint with the Egyptian Jewish social context. In doing so, the traditional notions of literal or free styles of Septuagint translation, often thought to coincide with notions of good or bad Greek, are falling under renewed scrutiny. For example, in his examination of Greek demotic translation activity in Ptolemaic civil administration, James Aiken has found similarities to the approach of the Septuagint translators. These include matters of register, lexical consistency, transliteration, interpretive renderings, etc. On this basis alone, scholars can no longer assume an idiosyncratic approach or linguistic incompetence on the part of the Septuagint translators. Instead, it appears that the kind of language we find in the Septuagint is the result of standard translation practice in Egypt, or potentially. This is the multilingual social context in which it should be understood. So studying the language of the Septuagint must go hand in hand with study of the contemporary, non-literary documentary evidence in Egypt. And I have a quote here from James. So James Aiken is my doctoral supervisor, and he says in one of his recent books, when there is documentary evidence to hand, to rely on one's predecessors is to miss an opportunity for providing the full picture of the word's meaning. And by predecessors there, he means mostly Greek lexicons, which fail to incorporate documentary evidence for the most part, except for DGE, of course. A particular focus in this lecture will be on understanding the semantics of Greek vocabulary and the motivation for its revision in the book of Judges within the Hellenistic social context or contexts. As I will describe shortly, Greek Judges has a complicated textual history. Yet it makes for interesting linguistic research because, despite its significant revision over time, for the most part, it always says the same thing, but in slightly different ways. As Natalio Fernandez Marcos has noticed, Although the most significant revisional changes made to the Old Greek translation of Judges are clearly associated with the Kaige movement, they appear to be motivated by more than the simple desire to revise towards a different Hebrew Vorlage. To quote Fernandez Marcos, the revision of Judges is not only conditioned by the criterion of closer approximation to the Hebrew, but probably has something to do with the linguistic tastes of the time and the addressees of the target language. With this in mind, the 2 case studies, and possibly 3 if we have time, we'll look at today focus on instances of consistent vocabulary choice in the Old Greek translation that were later changed to different words with equal consistency. These examples of systematic lexical substitution in the history of Greek Judges conclusively demonstrate, in my opinion, that textual revision in the Septuagint was not only motivated by a desire to better represent a Hebrew exemplar, but also motivated by and grounded in the linguistic developments in the Koine and the social context of the Greek translators and revisers. First, some comments about the textual history of Greek Judges. As of today, the Göttingen critical text remains in production, and hopefully soon will be finished. But in the meantime, the best critical edition published is Brooke McLean's Text of Judges in the 2nd volume of the Old Testament in Greek, published by Cambridge University Press in 1906. Unlike Rolf's, who printed 2 different texts that he considered 2 independent Old Greek translations, Brooke and McLean rightly compile a single text that they base on Vaticanus, and particularly since the work of Soisalan Soininen, the majority of scholars now maintain that the evidence for Greek Judges all derives from a single Old Greek translation. And the text critical work of many scholars, including Pretzel, Billen, Schreiner, Soisalan Soininen, Bodine, Tarragona, Lindars, Fernandez Marcos, and others, many others, has proved sufficiently that there was a single Old Greek translation. This Old Greek then underwent a revision that led to at least 4 major textual groups. Let's see here, I have the Göttingen numbers for you. The Old Greek translation may be defined with a reasonable degree of certainty as best preserved in the Lucianic, or more accurately, the Antiochene recension, preserved in the A2 group. Old Greek is most reliably ascertained in and restored with the GLNOW and DPTV minuscules, especially where followed by the Old Latin version. It's important to note also that the Old Greek Vorlage was only slightly different from MT and rarely preserves a superior reading. In the research that I present today, whenever I say Old Greek, I'm referring to my personal reconstruction based on these text critical conclusions. Given some of the members of the audience here today, I look forward to gaining some insight on how this aspect of my work can be further refined. Importantly, it is the B group that has a clear relationship with the Kaige movement. Before moving into the case studies of lexical change, I will briefly outline my research method for the sake of clarity. In the first stage, the A and B texts of Ralph's serve as a point of departure. Using the electronic texts, I vertically align all the vocabulary in descending order of frequency, and that allows me to identify points of clear divergence between the vocabulary of the A and B texts. For example, why is it that the A text contains parataxis only once, whereas the B text contains the word 17 times? What words does the B text use instead, where A has parataxis? Are there any patterns apparent among these vocabulary items? What Hebrew words do they render? These questions then lead to a second stage where I examine each instance of this vocabulary in the critical apparatus of Brooke and McLean. And from there, I can attempt to determine which lexeme was likely used in the Old Greek translation and organize variants for that choice into the other textual groups. This creates a kind of artificial timeline of lexical revision for each case study. And as I'll talk about a little bit more, a striking feature of my research so far is the consistency of the Old Greek translator in his lexical choice for many Hebrew words. While the other two A groups tend to retain the Old Greek rendering, that choice is often systematically changed to some other Greek word or words in the B group. So moving on to our case studies. The two studies I will present here are selected because they represent the most pervasive examples of lexical selection and revision in the textual history of Greek judges that I have found. For the most part, the Hebrew text will not be addressed here, except to note the particular lexemes that are translated into Greek and later revised. As we will see, in neither of the case studies is the Greek revision motivated by the semantics of the Hebrew text. Instead, the revision of the Greek words is, I think, strictly motivated by the changing possibilities of communicating in Greek in the Hellenistic Jewish social context. The two case studies will deal with vocabulary related to battle and youth concepts, and if we have extra time, we'll look at one other group of words. Okay, so starting with battle vocabulary. From a narrative perspective, Judges is an extended account of the conquest of Canaan following the death of Joshua. The incomplete possession of the land, noted in Judges 1:1 through 3:6, precipitates a variety of military conflicts detailed throughout the rest of the book. There's lots of battle talk. And among the lexemes in Hebrew used to refer to concepts associated with military conflict, only a few occur in Judges. These include tzava, machaneh, givor, but of particular interest is lecham, which occurs 31 times, and milchama, which occurs 20 times. We're going to focus here on milchama, although pretty much everything that applies to milchama is true also of lecham. And I can explain that a little bit more. Among the textual groups of Greek judges, the lexemes used to translate lecham and milchama undergo distinct and consistent change in the revision of the Old Greek translation. While in the Old Greek translation, polemos and polemeo are often the preferred choice for rendering milchama and lecham, they are consistently replaced in the B group with parataxis and paratasso. Table 1 shows the translation trends for milchama, with bold-faced text to indicate vocabulary substitution. I haven't provided the textual groups or the witnesses to support these readings, but we can talk about that if you want. In every case, the Old Greek translator rendered milchama with polemos, or another lexeme from the same root. There's a few instances, 1817, there's polemikos. Yet in the B group revision, that vocabulary choice is consistently revised to parataxis in 15 of 19 instances. In addition to the questions raised by the consistency of both the lexical choice in the Old Greek translation and its later revision in Greek, it's also unclear at first why parataxis would be preferred, judging by the information provided in most lexicons. There you can find parataxis glossed with something like battle line or battle rank, a meaning that clearly does not fit with polemos. But most lexicons do not account for Koine literary or documentary sources. And as I will show in a minute, it is among these sources that we see semantic development of parataxis, by which it comes to mean ordered battle associated with hoplite military tactics. With this semantic development, parataxis becomes a near synonym of polemos, and the associated cultural background of hoplite warfare appears to have motivated its use in the revision of Old Greek Judges. Consider the following two examples from Judges where this substitution and the semantic change of parataxis is apparent. Some of these may be on your handout. I think most of most of what's on the handout is the Greek text. But you can see in this example, these are my reconstructions, they're very provisional. This is Old Greek, so every man of Israel went out to Polemon with Benjamin, rendering Milchama, and in the revision, every man of Israel went out to Parataxim, cross Benjamin. Okay, so that's one example, another example. Again, for Milchama, we did not take for each man of Benjamin a wife in battle, Polomeo, sorry, a wife for himself in the Polemo, and in the revision, take a wife for himself and take Parataxe. That's what we see continuously throughout the book. Quite direct substitution, and you can see that for the most part, there's some other grammatical changes, but as I said, for the most part, they say the same thing in slightly different ways. To summarize, the Old Greek translator typically chose polemos to translate Milchama, but the B group revision instead used parataxis for the same concept and revised the Old Greek text accordingly. To help determine the motivation for the revision of the Old Greek vocabulary choice, I'm going to summarize a semantic analysis of parataxis to demonstrate how it underwent semantic change in more educated varieties of Greek in the Hellenistic period, moving from its conventional meaning ordered battle rank in the classical period to simply ordered battle. And it's the newer sense of parataxis that is used throughout the B group revision of battle vocabulary and also throughout much of the Septuagint. Okay, so parataxis is a deverbal from paratasso, since in classical literature the verb paratasso appears in older sources and much more frequently. Throughout Greek sources, and I'm speaking all extra biblical sources here, paratasso and parataxis occur most frequently among the body of vocabulary used for describing Greek military tactics. At the center of Greek military strategy for land combat was the hoplite. Hoplite battle was conducted according to an established set of rules and strategy, played out in prearranged and decorous battles between organized but slow-moving phalanxes of heavy infantry in open space. This form of engagement was deeply embedded in Greek culture and was understood in the classical period as the normal way to resolve conflict and even entire wars among the Greek city-states, as early as the 8th century through the late 4th century BCE. And in classical sources, parataxis appears only about 10 times. We find there the earliest hints of the semantic development of the ordered battle rank sense into ordered battle. Okay, so here's just some, if you can't see that, it's a bit small. Just some statistics for parataxis throughout the timeline from the classical period through 2nd century CE. But the new sense, ordered battle, is only contextually motivated. It's not until the Hellenistic period that parataxis is used much more frequently and becomes polysemic by virtue of the entrenchment of the ordered battle sense, predominantly in the Greek military historians. And I'll give some examples. These should be on your handout. So from these are from Polybius. I'm just going to stand to get through these. Hanno was the one who was defeated in ordered battle at Agrigentum. And he goes on, I will mention one ordered battle, which, together with being one of the most remarkable ever joined, is also not too far distant in time. In Polybius, although the classical sense ordered battle rank continues to be used, parataxis means ordered battle, as here, in over half of its uses. So it appears that this construal of the word has become a fully conventional and coded meaning of this lexeme by the 2nd century BCE. This continues in the following century in the work of Diodorus Siculus. Some citations here. For Osiris was not warlike and did not organize ordered battles or engagements. The second one, number 4, as long as he, that's Hyksos, continued warring, the opposing side fled from fighting and would never come into ordered battle. I could proliferate examples from both of these authors. In these texts, it is clear that parataxis encodes the concept of battle distinct from kindunos, the engagements, or diapolemeo, for example, second, number 4. After a survey of both the Greek historians and early poets, the classicist Kendrick Pritchett argues that parataxis referred to the concept of pitched battle between hoplite phalanxes. After the turn of the era, Josephus, Plutarch, and Cassius Dio continue using parataxis to mean ordered battle, although with somewhat decreasing frequency of the lexeme. And I'll read these examples. No disorder scatters them from habitual formation. Indeed, one would not be mistaken saying that their exercises are battles without blood, and the battles bloody exercises. Number 6, for war campaigns do not forever consist of ordered battles and combats and sieges, but there are also times when they permit sacrifices and gatherings in between, and considerable leisure for pastimes and amusements. That's Plutarch. And then in Cassius Dio, they delayed many days, not joining into ordered battle, but attacking in some skirmishes and raids of both light armed troops and cavalry. You can see I chose these examples here because of the contrast in different types of military engagements, combats, sieges, and parataxis. Skirmishes, raids, and parataxis. So it's a clear concept. It's an ordered battle. Importantly, however, in the Koine documentary evidence, parataxis only appears 7 times before the 3rd century CE, and they're all in official inscriptions. Of these, 5 clearly prompt the battle sense, ordered battle, as in these examples. Number 9. Some of these are fragmentary, but I've chosen the best examples. So these men died in the ordered battle on the Isthmus of Duma, and then there's a list of names, and the inscriptions cut off. Number 9, Gaius Cornelius, son of Gallus, cavalryman from Rome, appointed as prefect by Caesar over Egypt after the defeat of the kings in Egypt, mightily conquering the defeated Thebaid in battle twice in 15 days. Okay, so this is somewhat fragmentary, but it's a fairly clear reconstruction. So these are official military decrees posted throughout Egypt. I think that's the only two. Okay, so this evidence could be supplemented significantly from Greek sources. In short, there's very little reason to doubt that, beginning in the 3rd century CE, the lexical item parataxis developed a second sense, ordered battle. In this light, the consistent revision to Old Greek judges that used parataxis to replace polemos makes perfect sense, as the 2 words are near synonyms. Importantly, however, this lexical change in the revision was not semantically motivated by the Hebrew text. Rather, since parataxis appears primarily in literary sources and official government decrees, it's probable that the revision was motivated by a desire to improve the text of Greek judges with a more educated variety of Greek. In terms of social context, this stylistic change must have arisen from the reviser or revisers' familiarity with Greek hoplite military tactics, or at least the literature about it. So, moving to a second case study now on youth vocabulary. By youth vocabulary, I mean substantive lexemes associated with stages of the human life cycle. The narrative of Judges provides many occasions to use this youth vocabulary, much of which coincides with military roles, given the amount of warfare in the book. On other occasions, the vocabulary pertains to various levels of age, class, or social status. Excuse me. While there are several Hebrew words used among the youth vocabulary, including bahur and taf, among others, it's na'ar that will be of particular interest here, since it is the most frequently occurring. In the textual groups for Greek judges, there are, again, noticeable patterns in the translational choices for na'ar, made by the Old Greek translator, on the one hand, and its later revision in the B group, on the other. On the one hand, the translator of Old Greek Judges selects paidarion to render na'ar in almost every instance. But in the revision, paidarion is retained sometimes, but elsewhere it's replaced by either paidion, neaniskos, or neanias. Table 2 shows the translation trends for na'ar. Hopefully you can see it. And again, bold-faced text indicates vocabulary substitution. The Old Greek on the left, and the B group revision on the right. As this table shows, in approximately the first half of the book, way down to about here, the Old Greek rendering is left as it is. But starting at 13 verse 8, and thereafter, paidarion is substituted by at least part of the B group with one of three alternatives. Neanias, 7 times, neaniskos, 4 times, or paidion, 3 times. Notice that all of these words are related by diminutive morphology as well. Neos does not actually appear in Judges, so that's why that's in gray. As mentioned, in some instances of the B group of witnesses, there's disagreement among the witnesses of the B group. This happens in 13:8, 13:12, and 16:26. This is particularly evident in 1919, where na'ar and avad occur together in the same verse, prompting different lexical choices within the B group. These are all B group witnesses. And you can see the first word is na'ar, second word is avad. And whereas normally the B group is quite unified, here it's obviously not, very discrete. So neaniskos, paidarion, neanias. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this. So not quite as unified as the military vocabulary. Yet in most other places there is good unanimity in the lexical choice of the B group revision. So in this example, Old Greek, there is a paidarion from Bethlehem, from Judah, from the family of Judah. And a revision, there happened to be a neanias from Bethlehem, from Judah. Why the change? Okay, that's what I'm asking. In addition to the questions raised, I have another example. No. In addition to the questions raised by the striking consistency of both the lexical choice of the Old Greek and its later revision, it is also again unclear what semantic distinctions exist among this youth vocabulary that would motivate the change. So this is just a collection of Greek lexicons you can see this is the new Brill Dictionary, Greek lexicon, LSJ, BDAG, and others. And for the most part, so you have pais, paidion, paidarion, and then neos, neanios, neaniskos. These are the diminutive forms. And for the most part, they're all the same. So young man, young man, young man. Young man, young man, young man. Young in age, young man, young man. It's all the same. So from the perspective of English, it's difficult to represent the semantic differences between these diminutive forms, and yet there must have been some difference because they're used differently. Judging by the glosses provided in modern lexicons, there's little to distinguish these terms. In this case study, we will focus only on where paidarion was substituted with neaniskos to show how the Hellenistic social context significantly clarifies the semantic motivation for the revision. In our investigation of the battle vocabulary, because the documentary evidence had only 10 instances of parataxis, the literary sources were more useful. But for youth vocabulary, the literary evidence is markedly less helpful, because there, when Greek authors discuss age terminology or stages of life cycle, they do so usually with sort of conflated with notions of numerology or astrology or aesthetics or biology. So a much more accurate picture of linguistic usage for this youth vocabulary is found in the non-literary documentary evidence, where these lexemes are very abundant. When it comes to neaniskos, understanding the semantics of this lexeme is inseparable from the picture of the Egyptian social context we find among documentary evidence. This social context involves the so-called ephebic system that, starting in the 4th century Athens, put males through 2 years of compulsory and highly structured military training. During their period of ephebeia, males around 18 years old learned to use weapons, patrolled nearby borders, and eventually took an oath of loyalty to the state and its religion. This ephebic training system was, quote, at the core of Greek civic identity, end quote. And by the 2nd century BCE, sources attest that it was open to non-Greeks. So it became one of the most widespread Greek institutions and was an important aspect of Hellenizing the ancient Mediterranean world, including Ptolemaic Egypt. And we see some of this in 2nd Maccabees, where the epheboi are mentioned. The ephebic system functioned as an important means of social mobility, which most likely drove its success in the Hellenistic world. Although the system slowly evolved and became localized, as we will see, evidence for the formal ephebic training system in Ptolemaic Alexandria indicates that it was very similar to the Athenian model as early as the 3rd century BCE. And there's a number of inscriptions that support that idea. In the course of his training, a male passed through 3 stages: pais, ephebos, and neos. These categories are abundantly clear in documentary evidence. The first distinction and transition between pais and ephebos took place when freeborn males began their ephebic training. Those who then finished that training were referred to as the neoi, and they were considered full citizens. Yet those finished with their ephebic training were also referred to by other terms as well, depending on the region. According to epigraphers in Egypt, it appears that neaniskoi was the preferred term instead of neoi. Moreover, the neaniskoi had certain rights and privileges associated with their social status. Epigrapher Cantarella concludes that this was so well known that the word neaniskos would have had a very socially significant connotation even in the vernacular language. And this is just what we find in the Ptolemaic papyri. These are on your handout. Apollonius to Zenon, greetings. You would do well immediately taking care that the quarters for the neaniskos are quickly made ready, just as I wrote before. Farewell. So the neaniskos have some priority here to Zenon. Number 11. Phanias to Zenon, greetings. The neaniskus, who were made kleruchs in the Arsinoite Gnome, I have determined I will count them all and administer oaths in Philadelphia. So you would do well to prepare a little room for me, for I happen to be poorly disposed in body. So at the same time, I would like to see you for as long a time as possible. Farewell. Okay, so here we can see the neaniskus are kleruchs. Right, they have some land from their time serving in the army. Number 12. Phanias to Antipatros, greetings. First, enclosed for you, and I'm very open to suggestions for better translations here. Enclosed for you is a copy I wrote of a letter by Diotimu to oversee the cavalry, to whom land is allotted that is able to be sown from year 35. So all is sown, and the neaniskoi in charge are able, having been supplied from the crops produced, to go down to the king by horse, and are fully equipped with whatever else they need. Okay, so they are supplied here from the crops, the neaniskoi. This is showing the different kinds of privileges associated with being a neaniskos. The final example recounts the arrival of Ptolemy III at Antioch in 246 BCE, where he was jubilantly received by the satraps and other leaders, and the soldiers, and the priests, and the magistrates, and all the neaniskoi from the gymnasium, and a surrounding crowd besides. So the neaniskoi are clearly associated here with the gymnasium in the Hellenistic Egyptian context. Oh, and a final example, again from the Zenon archive. This is interesting because it records the interaction of a neaniskos with an influential Jew named Yedus, who may have been a comarch in Palestine. In the letter, a figure named, it's kind of complicated, a figure named Alexander writes to Orias to collect a debt owed to Zenon by Yedus, the Jew, to whom Orias sent Zenon's agent Stranton, along with a neaniskos. So this is Alexander writing. He says, "Now I happened to be unwell as the result of taking some medicine. So I sent a neaniskon with Straton, and I wrote a letter to Yedus. When they returned, they told me that he, Yedus, had taken no account of my letter, but had laid hands on them and thrown them out of the village. So I'm writing to you. Goodbye." So these sources demonstrate that in Ptolemaic Egypt, the neaniskoi were civil functionaries who occasionally were lodged by civilians. We saw that in number 10. They could hold kleruchic lands, as in number 11. They were associated with the gymnasium, as in number 13. They received kleroi, as in 12. And they were bound by oath to the king, among other things. We can also say of this one in particular, there's some debate among the epigraphers about whether the neaniskon here is a servant. But judging by all the other uses of neaniskos and the sort of status that they apparently had, others propose that he's more of a police figure. The neaniskos is going as an officer, an official capacity, to collect the debt, which is owed by Yedus. although Yedus gets the upper hand, apparently. So given this background information for the semantics and social context of neaniskos, what can we say about the 4 texts where it replaces the Old Greek choice of paidarion? What motivated the lexical revision? The first text is Judges 16:26, the episode of Samson's death at the hands of the Philistines. As Samson entertains his captors, tied between 2 pillars, verse 26 says, Samson said to the Na'ar, holding his hand, etc., etc. In the revised text of Greek Judges, the Na'ar was not understood to be a paidarion, a young boy or servant. Rather, he is a neaniskos. The lexical change is perfectly understandable given Samson's violent campaigns against the Philistines in chapter 15, and the Philistines' continued efforts to capture him. Given that background, there is little reason to think that such a high-value prisoner as Samson would be entrusted to anyone but a trained neaniskos. If the neaniskos is a civil functionary, he's military trained, he has a police function of some kind. He's not a servant, he's not a young boy. If you have a prisoner, you entrust him to an officer. Similar situation appears in each of the next 2 revisions of paidarion with neaniskos in chapter 18. There, as the Danites reach Ephraim, they find the house of Micah and meet his Levitical priest. Verse 3 says, they heard the voice of the Na'ar, the Levite. Notice that the Old Greek here has a plus with the inclusion of the diminutive neoteru, but in the revision that is removed, possibly to be more coherent with the Hebrew text. But paidarion is replaced with neaniskos, portraying the Na'ar as more advanced in social standing, and perhaps also in age. The same change occurs without the Old Greek plus in verse 15 as well. Finally, in Judges 19:19, we see the significant disagreement among the witnesses to the B group revision. Here the Levite and his concubine have come to Gibeah and are being persuaded by the old man in the town square to be his guests for the night rather than spend the night in the town square. This man states that he has enough provisions for me, your maidservant, and the young man who is with your servants. We saw this before. So the Old Greek chooses paidarion for Na'ar, but this lexeme, being alongside avad, prompted disagreement among the B group witnesses. Although neaniskos predominates as the majority reading, 2 cursives contain paidarion and neanias as well. Note, however, that there is a clear distinction between youth vocabulary and servant vocabulary. So there's a lot of other material I could be bringing up here. I haven't really talked much about paidarion, but these words, pais and doulos, are very universally used for servants and slaves, whereas the neaniskos, the paidarios, these are young men, youth vocabulary. So there is a distinction here semantically between the kinds of words that are possible to use, although the witnesses disagree on which is the best use, obviously. Much more could be said, but it's clear from the lexical trends and Judges that the reviser felt paidarion did not make sense in every context, although the Old Greek translator apparently did. Moreover, it appears that the meaning and social context of neaniskos, for one, motivated the case in which this word was selected as an alternative in the Old Greek to the Old Greek choice. And that was done according to how the reviser or revisers understood the setting and details of the narrative context. I'm going to skip the third example. I don't think we have quite enough time, and just move to some conclusions. So we set out attempting to bring together study of the Septuagint with lexical semantics and the social context of Egyptian Judaism. I conclude now with some general observations on these topics that arise from the 2 case studies and from some others I've done in my other work. First of all, it should be obvious by this point, I hope, that the language of the Septuagint must be studied in the light of non-literary Greek sources. This is due, first of all, to the fact that most modern Greek lexicons do not sufficiently cover even the literary sources, Polybius, Diodorus Siculus, etc., much less have a hand on the documentary evidence. In effect, the very large body of evidence that is most relevant to the study of the Septuagint is left aside, unless scholars take the time and effort to examine it for themselves. And more are doing that now, I think. Secondly, the language of the Septuagint must be understood as normal language. That may sound pedantic, but it is still very much debated among Septuagint scholars. The fact that the text of the Septuagint is a translation is enough for some to dismiss its value for Koine Greek lexical semantics. But this is to confuse translation language for code. There is little doubt in my mind that despite all of its oddities as a Greek text, the Septuagint communicated in and as Greek. To that extent, we should analyze it using sound linguistic theory to examine Septuagint lexical semantics and account for how its language was used, like all language, for communication. Thirdly, we must attempt to situate the language of the Septuagint within its social context. Admittedly, this is a difficult task since we know virtually nothing about who translated what parts of the Hebrew Bible and where. But for the most part, scholars agree on the Egyptian provenance of much of the Septuagint, and wherever enough consensus exists for that assumption, it should be our starting point for social context. Sifting through the large grouping of papyri and inscriptions from the Ptolemaic period can complement efforts to determine social context as well. For example, one of the classicists I cited earlier claims that neoniskoi were the equivalent of the neoi in Egypt, as I mentioned. Since neoi, as the lexeme neoi, is almost completely absent from the documentary evidence from Egypt, whereas neoniskos is very prevalent. Admittedly, that is an argument from silence, but it is intriguing to note that a neos is never used in the Greek Pentateuch to refer to a young man. We only find neoniskos, just as Forbes, the classicist, as he suggests, would lead us to expect if the Pentateuch was produced in an Egyptian social context. Taking these things into account can provide insights into the various motivations for the Old Greek translation practice and trends in its later revisional activity. By focusing on these case studies where a single Hebrew lexeme is translated consistently in the Old Greek and then revised at a later point, we have sidestepped the possibility that the revision was motivated by the Hebrew. The Greek words we've examined are all near synonyms, so there's no grounds on which to think the revision was motivated by a different Hebrew vorlagom, and we have found no semantic grounds to say that the revision was motivated by a sense that the Old Greek translator got it wrong somehow. The revision is not a correction of a wrong translation. It is an adjustment or a modification of a translation that is deemed inferior for some reason. The revision is motivated by Greek, not by Hebrew. In these case studies, we have seen at least two factors in the Greek language, per se, that appear to have been part of this motivation. First, the process of semantic change, as in parataxis, that went from ordered battle rank to ordered battle. And the Septuagint contains a great many instances of that lexeme used in the newer sense, which is valuable lexicographical data. Importantly, the social context of the semantic change for parataxis seems to have been the more educated variety of the language, as found in the military historians and the official epigraphical decrees. But it's not part of the vernacular register, where the new sense is absent among papyri. This observation leads to the second factor in the Greek language that motivated revision in Greek judges, namely that what might be called stylistic concerns deriving from the social context. This was the case for youth vocabulary, with the Old Greek choice to use paidarion for all translations of na'a was unsatisfactory to the later reviser. Instead, certain instances of paidarion were replaced with other words according to how they were used and understood within the social context of Ptolemaic Egypt. This included leaving paidarion unchanged wherever it made sense according to the reviser. And in the absence of other clear sources of motivation, for the revision to use a more educated word, parataxis, to replace polemos, it demonstrates a concern for improved linguistic style in the target text as that was defined in the social context. These perceived improvements to the language of Greek judges did not stand at odds with the parallel motivation to bring that language into greater conformity with the Hebrew. One can make syntax more Hebraic while making lexicon more Greek at the same time. Thank you for your time.
¿Algún comentario o alguna sugerencia? Natalio. Natalio, que te he visto que apuntas.
You first know you are the most expert at the moment on the vocabulary and the manuscripts of Judges. I have enjoyed your lecture very much because in some way you have described it. What I said in my article, the Geiger, the vision and beyond. You have put the beyond in extensively, and I agree. As I agree against some people that still think that both texts are due to different translations. Also, it is the first conclusion. We agree with you. The first, secondly, in the group of Vaticanos, now it is necessary to include the Sinaiticus, because the last part of Sinaiticus now online contains some part of Judges.
Yeah,
It's very, very important. And it is a pleasure to hear that that most of the changes in the text, in the revision of Judges, in the text of the group of Vaticanus, is due to stylistic reasons also. I agree completely with you, and that is why I am. It is very pleasant to hear you, and that you are doing the doctoral dissertation in this direction. Also, congratulations.
Good, I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said before, if I understood correctly, that lexically, this language of translation of the Septuagint was meant to be natural, right? Like that is why there has been some stylistic changes, right? So to adapt it to the sociological context and everything, right? So it is supposed to be natural. Is that correct? Is it
I would call it conventional Greek.
conventional? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that applies to the whole translation of the Septuagint, or that it applies more to a particular part of it, like Judges? Do you think it's also applicable to the Pentateuch, for instance?
So I would want to distinguish some things. When I say conventional Greek, I don't mean, I mean that in terms of the kind of language used semantically, okay? Not necessarily syntactically.
All right, yeah, okay.
But yes, I do think, especially in the Pentateuch, and most books in the Septuagint, although there are exceptions, are also conventional Greek from a semantic standpoint. So my assumption, contrary to many, is that the Greek translator is using Greek words conventionally. He's not making innovations, he's not coining words. Even if we don't have the evidence to back that up, it's my assumption that it's conventional Greek. Many people assume the opposite, that wherever we don't have evidence for a neologism or an unusual sense of the word, it's evidence that he's using funny Greek. It's weird or it's wrong. And I don't think that's justifiable. I think the translators are much more skilled than they're often. I think they're primary language speakers of Greek. Their decision not to use literary Greek style is not because they're incompetent. It's motivated by other factors, not linguistic factors, but by stylistic factors, possibly religious factors. I'm not sure. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I'm asking this as an outsider, as I'm neither in Bible studies or Greek, but I was intrigued by the whole debate about to which degree the revisions reflect, even though primarily semantically, since you said that the syntax is changed in order to show a reference to Hebrew syntax. I mean, it occurred to me that it also implies basically assumptions about the stability of text while it circulates, and rather because we assume that the Bible text within a Christian tradition is sacred, that changes to the text are actually really problematic. Whether it might be quite possible that for the circulation of judges in Hellenistic times, we had basically various Greek scholars copying texts which had less qualms about exchanging words.
Yeah.
So to some degree the question would be then less reflective of efforts of putting Hebrew in better Greek, or more appropriate Greek by reflecting changes in lexicon. So I sort of wondered, I mean, for me it could be possible, just listening to it, I'm coming from the field of Arabic and Hebrew, and Arabic and Persian. So the whole idea there, how text swirl around in various languages and how people feel comfortable changing around text. And we barely ever have a good debate of when do we actually get a concept that the text cannot be messed around with, or whether the text can actually be messed around with because we have a much less 19th century, 20th century concept of firmity.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Almost all of my research is focused on the Greek textual history.
Of course.
And others can chime in if they're more familiar with the Hebrew side of things. Obviously, Natalia Fernandez Marcos put together the Quinte edition, so maybe you can comment on the textual history of the Hebrew here. But it's my impression that in the cases, I'll see if I can pull up. Let's see. Maybe this isn't the best example, but even some of these differences here, let's assume for the sake of argument that the Hebrew is the same for the old Greek translator and their advisor. These are both perfectly legitimate translations of the same Hebrew text. I hesitate to talk about different vorlagen on the basis of varying translations, because you can do different things to render the same thing.
Of course.
So if we didn't have any idea that the Hebrew text was the same, it would be easy to create some Hebrew text that looked different, but you would be wrong. Or you would be right. We have very little idea when we're right or wrong on those things from the perspective of the Hebrew. Would you add something to that?
No, I think that basically the Greek translators had the same Hebrew text also in front of them also. because in the Qumran fragments, only a couple of examples have been recovered from the Hebrew judges, and they have no examples of different Hebrew texts. So only some mention, but not different synonyms or different texts.
I mean, I had basically wondered whether at a certain point the Greek text circulates on its own, so that basically people play with the Greek text without having even recourse to the Hebrew text. I mean, the question was also, can we actually assume that we have really the Greek and the Hebrew text circulate together, so that the people who would actually translate the Greek text would have access to the Hebrew?
Yeah, that I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure there's a way to really know that.
No.
I would probably assume there is some co-circulation among scribes. I don't think people aren't changing this haphazardly, and where they do change it, it's motivated, obviously. The question is, what is it motivated by? Is it motivated by the Hebrew? I'm saying that these changes aren't. They're motivated by Greek and language change within Greek, and the desire of the revisers to improve the text as they understand improvement. So they want to do two things. They want to improve the text by making it more conformed to the Hebrew syntax. And we do see that sometimes, right? This is actually a good example. Kaiganepe, right, is much more conventional for Vaihi. So that's changed. So he's doing two things here. He's changing it to be more conformed to the, if this was to say, of course, PHQ, it must be the original. He's changing it to be more conformed to the Hebrew text, more conventional for the Septuagint rendering for Vaihi. And he's on a syntactic level, it's motivated by the Hebrew. But on a lexical level, it's motivated by Greek.
Okay.
So you can have multiple motivations, right? And and that's people. Many scholars tend to only assume that revision is motivated by conformity to the Hebrew at the expense of Greek, and I don't think that's always true. It's true at a syntactic level. That's my final comment, that revision is motivated, what did I say? One can make syntax more Hebraic while making lexicon more Greek.
Exactly. I think it's
Yeah, I mean, that is actually the
answer.
more fascinating aspect then, to basically say that you have a sense of the changes in the sense of syntax and the change on the sense of lexicon don't seem to go hand in hand.
Right. Yeah. It takes a lot of work to show that one word is perceived as more appropriate. Right. From our perspective, it's the same. We don't know because we're not native speakers of Koine.
It is the case of Symmachus, that is very close to the Hebrew, and at the same time, it improved the style of Greek.
Yeah.
Ninguna pregunta. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.